Today we hear from two women on the front lines of environmental storytelling. Alice Eady is a documentary filmmaker, photojournalist, and co-founder of Earthrise Studio, telling stories of migration, climate, and social justice. And Malika Vaz is a filmmaker and co-founder of Untamed Planet, documenting spaces where people and wildlife collide. Both are National Geographic explorers. They work in different places, but share the same mission: use storytelling to shift perspectives, inspire action, and hold power to account. Together, we'll explore what it means to report from the ground, the ethics of telling someone else's story, and how visibility can spark change. I'm Alex Honnold, professional rock climber and founder of the Honnold Foundation, bringing you stories of inspiring people who are helping to solve today's most pressing conservation issues. In partnership with Rolex's Perpetual Planet Initiative, this is Planet Visionaries.
Hi, my name is Alice Eady. I'm a filmmaker, National Geographic explorer, and co-founder of Earthrise, a climate impact studio telling stories connecting us to nature.
Hi, I'm Malika Vaz, and I'm a filmmaker, a National Geographic explorer, and CEO at Untamed Planet, which is a film production company focused on telling stories about the natural world.
I grew up following the work of incredible documentarians who captured people and planet, and I was always passionate about the power of visual storytelling to change things. And I started as a photojournalist, really focused on forced migration, which led me to documenting human stories on climate frontlines. And whilst climate had been often spoken about as a nature problem, a biodiversity crisis, it was also a social justice issue. And so I turned my lens to capture people living on those front lines or disproportionately impacted or dedicating their lives to taking action on it.
I grew up watching stories around nature that felt unpeopled. And the reason I co-founded Untamed Planet is to tell stories about the human footprint on our planet and how we can get this right.
I think one of the moments that I knew that I wanted to be a storyteller was when I met my mentor, Lindsay Adario, an incredible American photojournalist. And she showed me how to show up telling difficult stories as she did from many front lines of conflict across the world, but to do so never losing her empathy, her joy, and her presence with people. And I found that very inspiring.
Malika, Alice, welcome to Planet Visionaries. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be here.
Very happy to be here.
So you might not be youth climate activists, but you are relatively young for having your own production studios and working on these types of stories. So tell me a little about each of your paths from documenting these stories to trying to, tell your own stories more broadly.
I started Untamed Planet in 2017 with my co-founder. So it's been a while. And I think what really drew me to this is the fact that I wanted to build a company that represented a diversity of ideas around nature and our place on our planet today. I started off telling stories in my backyard. I'm from Goa on the west coast of India and was obsessed with nature. I was a feral kid growing up, always in the ocean and running around, messing around. And I realized that I had incredible privilege there to be exposed to the natural world. And so I began to bring that to women from less privileged backgrounds who were survivors of domestic and sexual violence and incredible community members. And that showed me the power of the outdoors. Filmmaking for me was then a way to supercharge that by bringing stories of nature to millions of people across the world. And when I started Untamed Planet, the goal was to tell these stories, to reach out to people across every country in the world and help people to realize that protecting nature is the most selfish, self-interested thing that we can do. Because if we protect nature, we're protecting ourselves.
Yeah, I often think how lucky I feel to have really known pretty early what I wanted to do, and that I knew I wanted to be a storyteller. Maybe if I could write, I would have been a journalist, but I knew that I wanted to tell stories visually. I studied politics. My heroes were photojournalists, documentarians who traveled to front lines to tell stories. And, one of them was a photographer, Don McCullin, who took images of the Vietnam War. And the images he took really changed public discourse in the US. So, heroes like that, I saw you could take images and really shape things and change things. So when I then went to study politics at university. That kind of gave me the geopolitical framework, but I knew that I wanted to shoot. So after I left in 2015, it was the height of the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis in Europe. And so I started to document initially as a photojournalist. And for those first few years of my career, I would travel across Europe and the Middle East to really tell stories about forced migration. But all along those stories, there was this looming sense of, wow, these trends of forced migration may only get dramatically worse, actually, because of this thing called climate change. It was not a story or an issue that I had engaged with. I wasn't like you know, I didn't really see myself as an environmentalist growing up. I wasn't part of a school society. I didn't spend that much time in nature. But when I realized that climate was going to be this all-encompassing issue that would impact everything we cared about, and I knew I cared about, you know, women's rights as a woman and all of these different issues, when I understood that they were all connected, that's really how I arrived to climate. And then 5 years ago would co-found Earthrise. And that was born out of my own desperation, I guess, to see climate stories well represented, told in a less fear-mongering doomsday way, I guess, than we had seen, but also to meet young people where they were at, which is consuming and getting educated on social media. So Earthrise started to tell short-form stories across social, really focused on, I guess, celebrating the power and potential of human nature.
It's interesting to hear you say trying to meet people where they were. And actually, the thing I think is really interesting about your story is that you know, I mean, I interview a lot of people from Planet Visionaries, and almost everybody has some kind of deep love of nature from the beginning. And it's actually quite refreshing to hear somebody that comes to it a different way. I have a foundation called the Holland Foundation that supports community solar projects around the world.
Yeah.
But I always kind of cared about nature, but never cared that much about the human side. But now we support community projects around the world because I kind of came to the same conclusion going the other direction that you did, which is that if you're trying to protect nature, you have to protect the human populations involved in it, the people living there.
Right.
But it's interesting that no matter which issues you care about, you ultimately wind up coming back to both, because it's like humans are, you know, we live all over this planet. It's like if you're not taking care of human needs, you can't really solve environmental needs either.
For sure.
It's like sometimes I think that the environmental movement maybe sets too high of a bar for entry with that kind of thing, where it's like, oh, you have to love backpacking. And I'm like, you know, if you don't want to camp in the dirt, that's fine, but you can still respect other life on Earth.
I completely agree. And a lot of the work I do is broadcasting, but a lot of it is actually what I call narrowcasting to business leaders and people who don't intrinsically come into it with a love of nature. And I think I've been trying to do this recently where I go into these rooms and talk about these issues without using the word climate change, without talking about sustainability. Because at the end of the day, climate change is risk. Sustainability is efficiency. If you can talk to them in their language and help them to understand that actually this is about protecting businesses too. It's about creating a more resilient economy. It's about actually protecting everything that we have in the built environment.
I think that, and I have been guilty of this, you know, just shouting about the problem, saying climate change exists, isn't working now as it has been. I think that was a really important...
Do you feel like it was working in the past? Because I mean, I think that's a fair question.
I think there was amazing momentum. I really do think over the past few years, there was incredible momentum, and awareness has massively increased. And it did feel as though we were winning the fight against climate denial. It really did. There's recently been a huge rollback in environmental policies. So now, how do we have this conversation? I wish I had clear answers, but for me, creatively, talking about nature, yes. Talking about connection rather than disconnection, but also this term that keeps kind of emerging of Trojan horsing the climate narrative into different stories. So how can we tell stories that the audience member doesn't immediately feel they're being preached to, that isn't immediately clear that it's a cause-driven climate film? In narrative, even in fiction, a world that I am barely scratching the surface of now, and to be honest, never thought I'd think about, but it's clear the amazing appeal that fiction films have. And how can we tell a love story that has climate perhaps unfolding in the background, but isn't in the foreground of the story? How can we weave this in creative ways? That's the creative challenge right now.
How do you hide the vegetables?
Yes.
That's the other way to frame it.
That's a good way of saying it.
Yeah, you hide the vegetables. So how are you each trying to do that in your own work? I mean, so you've laid out the scope of the problem. I mean, what are you each trying to do through what kind of projects are you working on now, and how do you use those to bring people in?
We're working on a multitude of different projects, everything from a series about how do we reimagine how we eat on our planet, to looking at natural history films that celebrate the beauty of the wild outdoors, to investigative documentaries that look at the problem and the solutions. Alice and I were actually in DC a couple of months back, and we were talking about how both of us as production company owners don't have a narrow focus on one kind of storytelling. We don't just focus on the oceans or don't just focus on communities. We kind of tell a wide range of stories. And I think initially my initial thought on that was that maybe I need to find a focus area. But as I get older, I think it's actually beautiful to be able to dip your toes into different places and tell different kinds of environmental stories, because we do need the love stories. We do need the fiction and the nonfiction. I think it's just a multitude of stories told really well. That's what's going to change the way we think about nature. We need to mainstream nature so that when you wake up in the morning, you're seeing it in the subway, you're seeing it on the news, you're seeing it in educational materials, you're seeing it not just on the National Geographics of the world. This is something that we need to mainstream in the biggest way possible.
And I guess in mainstreaming it, finding the different levers and leverage points that are going to land with people. What do they care about? You said that you picked up on me saying, meet people where they're at. Well, that's why, we tell a lot of stories that go out across social, because that is where young people are consuming media and getting educated.
Is there a difference between trying to make stories for youth versus older people, or what are the different formats and how do they work? I mean, I personally have never really thought that much about the different types of media or how to target it in that way, but obviously you guys have. And so what are you doing?
Well, to speak to Malaka's point, we, as relatively young companies, we have to be, I think, agile, and we both sort of play across multiple formats and have a sort of hybrid approach. We make very, very short form content that goes out on social, to short films and all the way to feature documentaries. So being multi-format, I think is really important, because you're going to be reaching different audiences. I don't know if you saw the stats recently, but YouTube has bigger viewing figures now than all streamers and TV combined. So there's a real sea change happening. And at the same time, my absolute undying love and passion for documentary, the industry is really struggling in different ways. It's really tough times for the industry. It's definitely a time where we have to be smart about how we work and how we get the stuff funded. During Climate Week, during COPs, all year round, storytelling is paid a lot of lip service. We know the impact that it has, but we have to find the right funders to support that storytelling, and it's not always easy. And that's a mix of philanthropy, distributors, streamers, commissioning, but also brands.
I've never thought about our company as a company that reaches out to young people only. Yes, a lot of our team is young. We have people of every age range we've worked with, but we tell stories for every single age range, and we tell stories for every single part of the world, over 150 countries and millions of people. And the idea is that no matter who you are and where you are, you can use your sphere of influence, or as I like to call it, your impact orbit, to really change the way that we can protect nature today.
Do you think that people are maybe too risk averse in the stories they're willing to tell? And is that maybe an opportunity for the types of production companies that you guys are starting with? Because in a way, the beauty of starting from scratch is that you can go places that other people aren't willing to go. You're able to be nimble, take risks, like tell stories that other people won't. Or do you think that the big networks just should be taking more risks, should be willing to ruffle some feathers and, rock the boat a little bit or whatever?
There is a kind of self-censorship happening at very high levels with streamers. They don't want to take risk. And, we were very lucky to be at the premiere of Ocean, Sir David Attenborough's film. The Keith Scoley, who worked on it, it even took Sir David and that production some convincing to get commissioned. People think no one's going to watch a depressing film about how sick our oceans are, even with the legend that is Sir David attached. So I think those conversations are hard, but the payoff is epic when it works. People want it, and I think it's getting tonally right. What's so brilliant about Sir David's shows and all those programs and the programs you make is it balances urgency with optimism, education. It doesn't pull punches, but it also offers people a sense of optimism at the end. And that optimism isn't naive hope. It's sort of a sense of agency. We do have the chance to do something about this. It is up to us to take action.
So that's a question for both of you guys. How do you get the tone right? Because I think you're right that part of the reason people don't like watching documentaries is because they're depressing, because there isn't that much good
sure.
environmental news to some extent. And so how do you strike the right balance where you can remind people that they have agency, that they can take action, that there's a lot to fight for, but not pull your punches, you said, but show the actual challenges in the world right now?
I think balancing nuance and entertainment is really critical. It's very easy to have this kind of hipster disdain for popularity and be like, no, we're making this cerebral film that our mom and dad and like 6 other people are going to watch. We have to make sure that we are finding ways to make these subjects more interesting. Sometimes, I ask myself, do I really need to go climb that mountain or go dive into that ocean to talk about ocean conservation?
You always climb the mountain.
You always do it, right?
Yeah.
And I think actually what it brings in for us, adventure is a big part of the stories we tell. That adventure allows us to bring people into the room. And so I think the entertainment is really important and the nuance is even more important. And I think what I really appreciate about your work and the work your foundation does is that celebration of nuance, of the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There is no singular story. There are these incredible multitudes, and we have to really synthesize those into the stories that we tell today.
For sure. And really have integrity about how we go about it. I can see, having made so much content that does go out on social, there is, I often think of social media as the kind of economy of outrage. Things that are really alarmist, built around fear and outrage, do very well on social media. So that's really to be resisted. We have to not lose that nuance. We have to both reach mainstream audiences by making it accessible. Super important. Don't overcomplicate this stuff. My job is to help scientists communicate. So I want to strip it back without losing the nuance. That's super, super important. Make it entertaining where possible and where relevant. But to not be alarmist because that the story will then have more viral appeal. I think we need to be really, really careful.
You've got to challenge yourself personally. I'll give you an example. When I first started making documentaries as a conservationist, I was drawn to stories of wildlife trafficking. And so my team and I went across the world telling stories about manta ray trafficking pipelines for National Geographic. And we told stories about shark finning. And a lot of those stories were singular. I was going undercover, pretending to be a seafood trader, dressing up, wearing these, glasses with cameras embedded in them. It was like the adrenaline of it, incredible, right? And then I realized that in a sense, I was telling these singular stories about wildlife trafficking, which needs to be counted at the highest levels. But at the lowest end of the pipeline are these incredible people who are risking their lives out at sea, who are barely being able to put 3 meals on the table for their families, who have kids who they're looking after with this work. And I realized when I had a sense of empathy.
You mean those are the actual traders, like people who are poaching
the beginning of the pipeline,
yeah,
right?
Of course.
And so when I got to hang out with these guys and become like real friends after months of hanging out together, making these films, I realized that they're also victims of the system. Climate change is impacting them too. And for me, that was challenging myself to say, hey, let's stop talking about, the logger and the trafficker and the criminal, because those are exciting, sexy stories, and think about the systems. And so in the last couple of years, we're talking about climate change now. We're engaging with the systemic problem and the systemic solutions that can be game changers.
I also think depth. Right, I've made thousands of pieces of short form media that go out across social, and I find myself increasingly gravitating towards making feature docs. My mentors would always say, return to a story, go back. And you must have returned many, many times to the places you climb. You've returned endless times to the stories that you document. These things take time. The relationships take a lot of time. So much of our work is about building trust and human connection with the people who are generous enough to share their stories with us. So that's also really important. And of course, with more depth comes more nuance and more complexity. And I think that's really important to remind myself too. Don't go to the easy stuff. Challenge yourself to make the projects that can take years to come about. And, I've been working on a film in Brazil following Brazil's first indigenous minister, Sonia Guajajara, for the past 4 years.
She's awesome.
She's incredible.
She's Brazil's first one.
Sonia Guajajara was already at the forefront of the indigenous movement in Brazil, really politically fighting for the protection of indigenous lands. And a few years ago, she decided to run for election for a position in Congress, and she would make history in winning that electoral fight. But Lula then beat Bolsonaro, and he decided to introduce Brazil's first ever indigenous ministry, and he chose Sonia as the indigenous minister, and she filled the ministry with all the indigenous people that had been fighting at her side. And for really this next chapter of the history of indigenous rights in Brazil, they gained political power, and we've documented that process. But it's taken years, hundreds of hours of footage to cut together. But I'm so glad to have returned so many times and to be working with an amazing team in Brazil. Those projects take time.
Will that be a feature documentary eventually?
It'll be a feature documentary. Stay tuned.
Or 10,000 social shorts. It'll be like an epic reel or something.
Well, so it will be a feature documentary, hopefully coming out soon. But, I think of Ocean again. An incredible feature doc. So many people won't see it though. But what they might have seen is the clip about bottom trawling that went completely viral online. It's a minute-long clip of the first time bottom trawling was ever documented. It was shared hundreds of millions of times. So a fraction of people might have seen the full film, but at least if they saw that on social media, it was impossible not to be moved and not to be shocked by that. And I know it's had huge impact. So I think it speaks to the point that we've discussed, multi-format, really thinking about who you're trying to reach and the different ways to package a story. That could be an incredible story like Sonia's. And you're right to say we should make the feature doc, but we should also make the 10-minute version, the 1-minute version, and all the social assets associated. And I think that is the future of storytelling, is to experiment more. So I don't know that I've cracked the code, but I'm definitely testing and experimenting more than I ever have.
It's one thing to share these stories and hopefully get the issues in front of a wide audience, but it's another thing to see results in terms of conservation or like actually protecting some of these areas. So have any of the stories that you guys worked in resulted in change in the world? Or, I hate to say like, has it been worth it? But like, talk about impact, because I mean, ultimately, if you're trying to share things for an audience, you are hoping to see some kind of change, right?
We made a film about manta rays that resulted in a conservation initiative where we had researchers from across India studying these animals and put across a policy proposal that's currently still making its way up the ranks. So that was exciting to have a conservation initiative that was, kind of coming out of a documentary
film. And what was
it?
To protect manta rays in some way? Or?
Yes, and to get them listed in India's legal documents. So get them protection domestically, because international protection is amazing for wildlife, but I think domestic protection often is that key change that we need. We worked in a film called Planet Defenders, and what was really exciting, but actually your team also worked on that, right? And what was
you guys are both Planet Defenders? So that's cool.
So what was exciting about that was the film that we did was about elephants and how elephants get trafficked because of the tourism industry. After years of talking about the impact of wildlife trafficking and really focusing on stories in Southeast Asia for the most part, I felt a responsibility to talk about the tourism industry and how that impacts wild animals. And so we met with these incredible conservationists who are protecting animals like elephants, rescuing them from a lifetime in captivity. These elephants get, people go and ride them and pet them and do all sorts of things, but they've spent 25, 35 years just in captivity being abused. And so we told the story of these elephants and the trafficking that happens, but also this amazing work that this organization, Wildlife SOS, does to rescue them and rehabilitate them. And one of my favorite moments ever was when the rescued elephants met each other for the first time and they created this new family. And when that film went out on television, I had people from across the world reaching out to me and saying, I had no idea that these animals, were taken from the wild and they were abused behind the scenes. And for me, the fact that someone would make a different decision based on a film that they watched, that to me is impact. And I'm excited to tell more stories that do that.
Alice?
We have been part of campaigns that have seen the stop of the incredible Ciel Yasuni campaign in Ecuador, which stopped oil drilling in the Yasuni National Park. And that happened through the first ever national referendum, to make a vote on that. We've been part of campaigns to protect 13 new areas in Brazil to be returned to indigenous communities through demarcation. So it's always a team effort, and so many people go into creating these historic tipping points in social movements. It occurs across timelines too. Some of this work has short-term gains, but cultural shifts, the values shifts that we're trying to create can take decades. So I also know that whilst we celebrate the wins in the short term, I am doing work that I hope we may not see the fruits of our labor for a long time, and we do it anyway because it is worth trying.
Yeah, what would you guys each say to somebody who's interested in doing the same kind of work? Somebody who's interested either in the storytelling or sort of in the movement building.
For anyone who is excited about nature and conservation, no matter whether you're a filmmaker like we are, or whether you are someone who works in the corporate sector, your storytelling matters. We're all telling stories every single moment of the day. And honestly, I think what's so important right now is humility. For me, the biggest takeaway is that film is impactful, but it is not enough. The reason I think about impact so often is because of my friendships and connections with scientists and researchers and policymakers and business leaders. I think really creating those partnerships is so important, because I know that our team will jump from one film to another film to the next film. But if we're able to create impact campaigns and impact partnerships, rather, that are focused on amplifying stories from the field, but also figuring out how do we have impact beyond that distribution date on television, which is super exciting. That's when we know that we're actually seeding these incredible ideas that will continue to live beyond the films.
So many filmmakers and so many of us are exhausted by the time the film comes out because we worked so hard. But then in a way, another part of that work begins the moment that it's out in the world.
What's the point of the film if not the impact campaign?
Exactly. So how can you be really strategic about that work with experts? Because narrative change, the things we're talking about, it is strategic, careful work. And I often lean on many other people to come together to build those campaigns. But I think that's really important. And it's a growing field, impact producers, champion them, get to know them. What would I say to someone who wants to do the work that we do? We need you. The best advice I have ever been given is find what you're good at, find what the world needs, and then contribute in that way. You do not actually need to be a filmmaker. Please join me if you want to be one. But find what you're good at and what you can contribute. Given my passion for storytelling, it was natural that that's what I wanted to offer, to be in service. And we have gained so much, I think, and I can speak for both of us, by having a life that feels aligned with our mission and being in service. It gives me a sense of purpose. And I actually think so many of us are lacking a sense of purpose right now. So it isn't a sacrifice to join this movement. It is really hard work and it can be really depressing, and we need each other. We need friendship and we need the people around us to do it, because there's a lot of reasons to feel like giving up. But make no mistake in thinking that I don't benefit from this too. This is my life force and I get it from doing this work because it's my purpose, it's my mission, and I will never give it up.
It is genuinely the best job in the world. And I think with that joy comes responsibility.
Yes.
One of the reasons why I went from only telling stories for TV to now working with Fortune 500 CEOs on helping them tell their story is because I think it's so important to get the private sector in this conversation too. Yeah. At a time where we have decreasing government support for conservation in the US, in Europe, in parts of Asia, we need to make sure we're creating alliances between brands, amazing companies, and amazing storytellers. And I think that's what's going to really be the lever for change that we need.
I love hearing your passion. I was like, oh, you're so fired up on storytelling. I was like, that's when you know that you're working in the right field.
Yeah.
Because, that's how I feel about going rock climbing.
Yeah,
I'm like, oh, I love going climbing, but I would never want to have to make films or tell stories, because that's not my calling for sure.
But also
I was like,
risk.
but it's clearly...
Risk is kind of intrinsic to the work you do. I was thinking about this before. The work you do is taking on risk, and the work you do is taking on risk. And I think to anyone who's hoping to get into the space, I feel like you've got to aim for those moonshots. You've got to be okay with iterating. Yes, we all grew up hearing a certain kind of story and a certain kind of storyteller, but you've got to say, that's how the other climber did it, but this is how I'm going to do it. That's how the other person told the story, but that's how I'm going to do it. And I think that sense of risk is that passion for risk, rather, is where it's at.
To what extent did each of your families kind of support your rather unconventional paths? Because both of you are in a different place than the average.
It's funny because my dad always said, and I feel so lucky, he said, do what makes you happy.
My parents are my best friends. My siblings are my best friends. I feel so grateful to have a family who I'm incredibly close to, and they share in my joy and excitement. And, when I send a film across to my parents, they will tell me what they love about it, but equally they'll tell me how I can be better. And I think that support, but also critical feedback is critical.
I actually really appreciate when people start to slightly dispel this myth of work-life balance, because is it possible? When we work as hard as we do and we want to achieve the things that we want to do and make the impact we want to, you can see how work-life balance slightly tips out of balance. But a friend offered me a different framework, which was work-life integration. And I love that. And I feel that's what I have. I laugh with my colleagues. I do work that I love. It doesn't mean that it doesn't feel like work, but I feel so lucky to do it. And so if you can align your work, join this movement and have it align with your purpose and your mission, there is no greater privilege, I think.
That's certainly always been the case for me as a climber because, I mean, it's not work. That's just life. You go climbing all the time.
And
I mean, climbing
exciting.
especially because you don't even have days of the week. You just have climbing days or rest days.
Oh, really?
So it's like you just literally, you're like, oh, my life is just like,
Oh, it's the same with film, actually. We don't have Sundays off when we're filming. We'll take time off when we have to, and our
you
crews
rest
looks
when you
after.
have to or when the weather's bad.
Yeah.
But that's exactly like the climbing life.
But how are you managing it, Alex? Because you're not just climbing now. You're doing so much. You're running the foundation. You're doing this. Do you have so much to be doing? How do you find balance?
The biggest thing is that I have 2 small kids now, so that's even more than any of the other things.
It's a lot of things to be doing,
yeah,
but you're doing it effortlessly, and I think honestly,
with quite a bit of effort.
at
It's
least
maybe
from the outside.
a calm above the surface, paddling like mad below the surface.
I honestly think that having multiple things that you pour 100% into gives you more energy. Because if you're working on one aspect of work for 4 hours and then another aspect of work for 4 hours and another for 5 hours, it actually feels like you get to jump between different ships, but also learn from those connections. And I think that actually that gives me so much fuel and energy every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I do kind of agree with that. I mean, particularly with climbing, if you can only try physically hard for a few hours in a day, really. And then you can spend the rest of your time, doing engaging interviews. Like actually after this, I'll go to the climbing gym and I'll try really hard for a few hours physically, but they do complement each other really well. Where it's like you can use your mind, you can use your body, you can use, all aspects of self. But, well, you guys, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat. And thank you guys for coming on Planet Visionaries.
This
what
was
a pleasure.
amazing. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Malika and Alice, for joining me. We'll put links to your work in the show notes. Planet Visionaries is a podcast in partnership with the Rolex Perpetual Planet Initiative and a Sony Music podcast production.